Welcome, everybody. My name is John Malia. Had the pleasure of studying composition with Robert Cogan from 1990 to 92, and he will be missed. Over the course of his long career, he created a body of highly individual work. In his work as a theorist, he created an unbounded and globally inclusive approach to analysis in his book Sonic Design, and further developed those ideas with the help of scientific technology and spectrographic analysis. We'll be talking about his music, his work as a theorist and an educator today. His music, for me, is filled with intensity, contrast, and risk. And we're going to start off today's discussion with a performance by Christopher Bush on clarinet of his composition, Fierce Singleness. Thank you, Chris.
force. Force of understanding, which by its fierce singleness, liberates on a fresh plane. Fresh plane. To perform in a new way. That includes the world. The world.
For that brilliant performance, and there'll be a lot more to come on tonight's concert, and we hope that you'll all be there for that, of course. I'm going to introduce our panelists for today's discussion, and I'll go in reverse order from the order that they'll be speaking in, starting with Anne Schreffler, who is on faculty at Harvard University and specializes in avant-garde European and American music since 1945. Anne is a graduate of NEC in both flute performance for her bachelor's degree and music theory for her master's. And then we also have Matthias Treniger, who is one of our beloved music theory professors here at NEC. In addition to being a theorist, he's also a composer and a cellist, and I believe has even performed some of Bob's work, if I remember correctly. And his research, in part, has been on the music of Elliott Carter. Next, we have Joan Heller, who blew my mind many times over in the 90s, as well as the minds of many other new music enthusiasts and practitioners, with her riveting performances of Robert Cogan's utterances for solo voice and some of his other vocal pieces as well. And she's former faculty from Southern Methodist University. Thank you for being here, Joan. And last, we have Lei Liang, who's coming to us from San Diego, where he teaches at University of California, San Diego. And he's made incredible contributions to the contemporary music scene, both nationally and internationally, and has won major awards, including fairly recently the Grawemeyer Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Thank you for being here, Lei. And Lei studied composition with Bob at NEC, and is going to discuss some of those experiences and also discuss Bob's music and its inventiveness.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, John, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very humbled to speak at this panel as a former student of Mr. Cogan. As one of the many students whose lives and artistic careers were shaped and changed by his teaching, I know mine is only one of the many incredible stories. Almost exactly 30 years ago, as a 19-year-old, I came to Boston in order to study with Mr. Cogan. I worked with him to obtain bachelor's and master's degrees at NEC and continue to look up to him as my mentor following my graduation. He was my mentor in the richest sense of the word. In one of our first lessons, Mr. Cogan shared with me about a metaphor that his own teacher, Roger Sessions, told him. He said, a composer should grow like a tree. The image of a tree has stayed with me over the past decades. Grow like a tree. Take no shortcuts. Spread your root. Dig deep. Branch off. Reach for the sky. Embrace the cosmos. It took many years for me to fully appreciate the meaning of this image. Listening to Mr. Cogan's music is to listen to images, to spectrographs, to memories, to history, to design, to shapes, to fractals, to language and music, to oppositions. Listening to his music, there is the double image of a tree, the composer and the theorist. These trees merge. His compositional output is like the growth of a tree, proliferating, branching off, open-ended. His works took time to grow, nourished by the nutrients offered by a distinguished and dedicated group of performers and interpreters. And his and Potiesco's annual Jordan Hall concerts, we witnessed the growth of this tree and how it transformed. Joan Heller and Elizabeth Cush in utterances and polyutterances, Domi Lee and John Sakati in many iterations of Mr. Cogan's works for voice and piano, solo piano, piano for hand. Being in his composition studio was nourishing in so many different ways. I'm sure many former students share this feeling. Guided by Mr. Cogan, we experimented together, inspired each other, discovered together. A tree became a forest. I wanted to share a personal anecdote. I would like to tell the story of, I took Mr. Cogan for coffee 3 times. The first 2 times were both prompted by my desire at the time to quit pursuing music as a career. We would sit down at a cafe and I would read him my prepared letter outlining my reasons. Each time he listened very patiently, let me finish, and then he will continue to persuade me to continue. And to this day, I thank him for his encouragement. He had more confidence in me than I did. And the third time I took Mr. Cogan for coffee was when I received my first royalty check from the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. It was in the meager amount of about $3, but it was perhaps the best cup of coffee I could get from my teacher at the time. For 6 years, I took a walk from Harvard Square to his Cambridge Avon Hill home along Garden Street for our weekly lessons. The walk was a filtering of the mind. Everything else disappeared. I was about to face my teacher. I asked myself on these walks, Have you tried your best? Have you probed deeply enough? Is there anything else you could have done to improve yourself? On August 1st, 2021, days before Mr. Cogan passed away, I went to Boston to visit him. It was our last reunion, and I took that walk along Garden Street again and relived that feeling. I was about to face my teacher again. Like a magnificent tree, Mr. Cogan worked and flourished until the last days of his life. His latest book, entitled Ear, Brain, Music, A Cosmic View, was finished only days before his passing. I was deeply honored when Mr. Cogan approached me in March 2021, asking me if I could write the foreword to this new book. And to end this short tribute, I will share with you a short paragraph from my foreword to show how his music, his thinking, and his teaching continue to nourish me. Here's from my foreword. As a pioneer in using spectrographs for musical analysis, Cogan brought the visual and oral dimensions together, allowing the listener to see sounds frozen in time, as if viewing an architectural drawing. At the same time, one can dive into the details of the harmonic spectra of a single sonic attack, appreciating its dense or sparse formations. The spectrographs enabled us to look at the sound with both a macroscope and a microscope. It lit up our imagination in two opposite directions, to envision an audible painting and a visible music. Perhaps the boundary between the two is no longer so clear. It is through Cogan's analytical vision that these hitherto separate domains of art and science became parts of an interconnected, continuous spectrum, creating the ground for new understandings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lei. Next on the panel, we have Joan Heller. Hi, Joan. And she worked very closely with Robert Cogan on performances of his vocal music and forms that were kind of ever evolving, open-ended folios, fierce singleness of which is also an example of that. And I wonder, Joan, if you can give us some insight into your experiences helping these pieces grow over the years.
Thank you, John. I want to express my appreciation to all of you who are involved with these events to honor the memory of Robert Cogan. Thanks to all of you. I'd like to share a few thoughts about my experiences working with Robert. My infatuation with his music began in the spring of 1968 when I saw a performance of Worlds One at Boston Symphony Hall. In the fall of that year, I became a Master of Music and Vocal Performance student at New England Conservatory. However, I didn't have an opportunity to meet Robert Cogan until 2 years later when he auditioned singers for a performance of phrases from Worlds One. He chose Jane Bryden and me to perform this new version of Worlds One at an aesthetics convention in Boulder, Colorado. Thus began my 40-year professional relationship with Robert Cogan. I was honored that Bob continued to write for me. I chose to sing his works because each performance was a new experience, usually a new version or sometimes even a new work. It was exciting, imaginative, and fun to play with his compositions. I mean no disrespect in using the word play. Bob's music requires one to be playful. When he wrote utterances, Cogan offered the performer choices of which pages to combine. Sometimes I chose, but more often Bob suggested which pages he wanted. However, when he sent me new pages to add to the folio, I definitely wanted to include a few of these, if not all of them, in the next version. We varied each performance so that I sang almost every page in the folio at one time or another. We would often communicate by telephone, which frequently overwhelmed the tonal capacity of the telephone system. Patrice Pastor and I had telephone rehearsals of a two-voice version of utterances renamed polyutterances. Oh, if we'd only had Zoom, it would have been much easier. Cogan's works require imagination and vocal flexibility. For instance, when he notated a wide trill, an oscillation between two pitches further apart than a major second, such as thirds and fourths, he asked me to experiment to see if I could accomplish the sound he wanted. I recall warbling a perfect fourth over the telephone to Bob's delighted laughter. Although Bob asked for extremes of vocalism, he never asked me to injure my voice. I only recall one instance when a different composer required normal singing on the exhale, but also rather abnormal singing on the inhale. This process was supposed to produce continuous sound, no breaks for breathing, somewhat similar to circular breathing that wind instrumentalists perfect. Singing on the inhaled breath causes cold, dry air with possible small particles to pass through and sometimes on the vibrating vocal folds. Cogan was appalled. Actually, so was I. This extended vocal technique was immediately removed from my bag of vocal tricks. As you know, Bob was particularly concerned with acoustics. We were very fortunate to have the opportunity to perform so frequently in Jordan Hall, which offers a wealth of acoustical variety. For instance, we performed phrases from Worlds 1 in the corridors, aisles, around columns, all over the stage, and even positions backstage. However, in a more traditional piano and voice work, it was either the Bronx poems or Salon Portrait. Bob separated the piano from the singer at quite a distance, about 8 feet apart, in order to attain tonal separation, balance, and textual clarity. Fortunately, John Cicada and I were willing to try this arrangement, and we made it work. Although we miss Bob's presence in our lives, his compositions and theoretical works will continue to inspire future generations. I encourage young musicians to try playing and singing Cogan's compositions. They deserve to be heard and experienced. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, for that beautiful account of your relationship with Bob. That was fantastic. Matthias Treniger is next, and I believe Matthias will share some thoughts on Bob's work as a theorist.
Yes, so thanks so much for these comments. I would like to focus a little bit more on Bob's work as a theorist, but before I start, I should probably say that Bob always referred to himself, and that's also true for Pozzi, by the way, as a composer/theorist. So he didn't separate these two roles that he played. And one of the first things that he said to me when I started studying with him at NEC was that he regarded composition and theory as two sides of the same coin. So creating music and reflecting on music were mutually dependent activities to him, one informing the other. And he also encouraged his students to take that attitude. It was important to him that theory be seen in connection with musical practice, and that was composition, but also performance and improvisation. So as a theorist, Bob always struck me as a truly expansive thinker, Like every theorist, Bob was concerned with musical details. I guess that's inevitable in that profession. But he was at least equally interested in exploring those larger connections between music theory and practice, for example, but also between music and other disciplines and other realms of thought, such as philosophy, for example, science, art, and literature. One of the first assignments that he gave us when I took his DMA seminar at NEC, which I think was in 1996, so one of the first assignments was that he asked each student to read and present a book on a non-musical topic. So he handed out a fairly long list of book titles, and he asked us to choose one of those titles and spend 2 weeks reading it, thinking about it, and then presenting it. And I don't remember the entire list. It was fairly long, as I said, but it included titles like Gilles Deleuze's 1,000 Plateaux, or Joseph Albers' Interaction of Color, or Benoit Mandelbrot, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, and many other such titles. So it was not an easy reading list at all. The book that I picked was Roman Jakobsen's Language and Literature, which is a collection of essays on linguistic topics, very loosely related to music, but it proved to be one of the most fascinating and inspiring, even musically inspiring in an indirect way, reading experiences I had at NEC as a student. So Bob had this tendency to think outward, or to see details as parts of a larger whole. And I think that quality is evident in all of his work as a theorist. Maybe for the first time in Sonic Design, which is the book that he wrote together with Potsy Escott in the early 1970s. Sonic Design is an attempt to propose a large theoretical framework for musics across stylistic, historical, and cultural boundaries. So the goal of Sonic Design was to provide an inclusive kind of theory, and the motivation for writing it came from the desire to overcome two fundamental problems in music theory. The first problem was the fragmentation of music theory into isolated fields of specialization, and the lack of an overarching framework that would allow these different approaches to coexist and to communicate with each other. And the second problem was the fact that traditional music theory tended to focus on a narrow repertoire of Western concert music, roughly between 1700 and 1900, ignoring or marginalizing all musics that were not part of that repertoire. So Sonic Design was an attempt to fix those two problems, or at least provide an alternative solution to them. For those of you who don't know Sonic Design, let me just briefly sketch how the book is organized. There are these 4 main chapters. The first chapter focuses on musical space, the second chapter on musical language, and the third one on musical time, and the last chapter on tone color. So these 4 aspects of musical structure were seen to be universal to some extent. So they are present in all musics to some extent. Let me also emphasize that sonic design is not a one-size-fits-all theory. So the intention of Bob and Potsy when they wrote this book was not to pretend that everything is the same, or that you would analyze every kind of music the same way and there are no differences, stylistic or cultural or historical differences. But they were trying to provide a framework that would allow the comparison between different kinds of music, and would also include those musics that were traditionally neglected. I don't think I have time to talk about all of these aspects in detail, but I would like to say a few words about the tone color chapter, because that's going to be important for our next discussion. The tone color chapter is perhaps the most original contribution of sonic design, or at least the most unique one. Tone color refers to the quality of musical sounds, but also to the way these sounds combine and evolve in the context of a musical work. Tone color as an aspect of musical structure had received relatively little attention from music theorists in the past. There were, of course, studies about single instrumental or vocal sounds. That goes back to Helmholtz, 19th century. So that wasn't new. But the question how these sounds behaved in the context of a musical work and how they combined to form larger sound spectra or spectral formations, that kind of questions was largely unexamined. And of course, the reason is quite obvious. There was no sophisticated technology to do that. There were no computer programs that could have performed the fast Fourier transformation of an entire piece at that time. That was very difficult to do, if not impossible. So Bob and Pozzi, for their tone color analyses, had to calculate sound spectra by hand based on information from scientists like Carl Seashore and others. And they were able to draw diagrams, spectral diagrams, that are actually quite close to the present day spectrographs. So the difference is actually not that big, except that these hand-drawn graphs just took an enormous amount of time to produce. It was very cumbersome to do that kind of analysis. And that was also a little bit the limitation of that tone color chapter in sonic design, because it just was very difficult to do a lot of analysis in that way. But sonic design does include two full-fledged spectral graphs of orchestra movements. One was Farben from Schoenberg's Opus 16, and the other one was Nuage from Debussy's orchestral nocturnes. So it was possible to do that. It was just a very cumbersome process. Interestingly, the situation changed quite quickly. So once sonic design was published in 1976, very soon after that, Bob received that famous phone call from a person working at IBM Watson Research Center, telling him that the computer program that he had been looking for in vain actually existed. So IBM had just developed a new technology to produce these spectral images of musical works, and they were willing to give it to Bob for his own research. And much of that research actually happened here at NEC in 1980 and 1981. And that research became the basis of Bob's next big book, which was New Images of Musical Sound, published in 1984, I believe, and received the Outstanding Publication Award from the Society for Music Theory. So we have somebody here who was actually part of that group of students at NEC who collaborated with Bob on these projects. And Schreffler, maybe I can pass on the word to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, in fact, what I have to say does complement very well what you were saying, Matthias. Thank you. And thank you, Joan and Lei. It's wonderful to hear your remarks. In May 1964, Michael Steinberg of the Boston Globe interviewed Robert Cogan, and he wanted to know, how was your first year at NEC? And Steinberg begins his article, "Music schools tend naturally toward conservatism. Robert Cogan does not." He quotes Cogan on teaching an undergraduate class in which Cogan said, "The students were all able to sing the theme of Elliott Carter's Variations for Orchestra as they are able to sing Bach chorales. It is all part," Steinberg continues, "of what Cogan feels is the most important thing to be done, bringing American musical institutions around to living in the 20th century." If Bob was pushing for the 20th century in 1964, by the time I met him around 1977, he was already firmly in the 21st. Students in his seminar, Psychophysical Analysis, and other classes entered a world in which music had an international scope. Balinese gamelan music, jazz, Gregorian chant, Stravinsky, and Mozart were all valued equally. Music theory was not just a means of describing pitch organization, but rather a multi-parameter intellectual enterprise in which music was analyzed in terms of musical space, time and rhythm, musical language, and tone color, as we've just heard from Matthias. We became particularly attuned to sound, tone color, timbre. We learned about the acoustics of the symphony orchestra, the spectra of different instruments, and the quality of their attack sounds, and most fascinatingly to me, about the acoustics of the singing voice. I was amazed later in my career to find out that most musicologists did not know that a clarinet sound resembles a square wave, or that vowels have formants, or that if you have 24 violinists in an orchestra, they are not 24 times louder than a single violin. And Bob talked about all of these things. I'm not bragging on my particular knowledge. We all knew these things because we learned them in class. Fast forward 30 years, the academic fields of musicology and music theory finally start to realize that there is great music beyond the European canon, and sound studies has become the next new thing. Bob Cogan was a prophet whose music and his vision of music was ahead of its time. Bob had an amazing ear, as we all know, unbelievable ear for music, and not just pitch, but every aspect of music. And he combined his ear with a voracious curiosity about sound and a scientific interest in sound. So, as Matthias also mentioned, Bob did close studies of 19th century sound research by Helmholtz and others, and early 20th century sound research. He and Potsy had really covered all of the territory you could cover and figure out what, before spectrography, how sound worked. So I wrote here sometime around 1977, but Matthias says it was 76, that's right, when Bob had the opportunity finally to work with a sound spectrum analyzer developed by Dale Teeney at the IBM Watson Research Center at Yorktown Heights, New York, and Charles Potter of the Juilliard School. Their initial results are documented in 2 articles in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America from 1979. And I'm grateful to my friend and former classmate, Alice Gabura, who was in on the ground floor of all this, for pointing me to these articles. Maybe she'll say some more later. And these articles are called Musical Spectroscopy. They called it Musical Spectroscopy. I guess there was no real word for it at the time. The first one is called that, and then the subtitle is The Real-Time Power Spectrum in Instrument and Voice Teaching by Potter and Teeney. And the second one was Musical Spectroscopy 2, The Sound Score in Composition and Analysis, authored by Cogan, Potter, and Teeney. So after this, Bob continued to work with the machine. I'm sorry, we just called it the machine, which for a time lived down in the basement near the backstage entrance to Jordan Hall. And it was gigantic. It filled most of this. It was a small room, but it filled most of the room. It was a very large machine. I guess I should remind some of the younger members of the audience that there were no personal computers, or personal computing was in the very rudimentary early stages at that time, and most people didn't have them, and certainly they were not capable of doing the kind of fast processing that this machine could do. So this was during my master's, which I did from here at NEC from 79 to 81, and it was an amazing and exciting time to be at NEC. The Sound Spectrum Analyzer was the site of so many wonderful experiments. We had class meetings down there and seminars, and we were also allowed to use the machine. And so many of us wrote our seminar papers, master's theses, and first publications using the machine. And I did some research on Baroque, comparing Baroque flutes and modern flutes. And I just remember how exciting it was to be able to have that in the building and go down and do that. So in 1984, as Matthias mentioned, Harvard University Press published Robert Cogan's book, New Images of Musical Sound. And this is an amazing work of visionary analysis and virtuoso interpretation. And this is a Beethoven piano sonata here on the cover. So you might be able to, Bruce can probably tell which one. Anyway, it's part 1 is entitled Images of Sound Structure, and it presents analyses of music ranging from Tibetan tantric chant to Varèse's hyperprism. And it includes an analysis of Cogan's own no attack of organic metals for organ. Part 2, entitled Tone Color, a Phonological Theory, ties it all together with what one might call a unified field theory of musical sound. And no one else, to my knowledge, has attempted such a thing since then, till today. So rather than me trying to describe the details or the brilliance of this book, and you can't really see the photographs from where you are, but please come up and take a look, or I'll show you later. But rather than me trying to describe it, I'm just going to end by quoting a passage from Bob's analysis of Billie Holiday's performance of Strange Fruit. So here we go. Note bending is a motif that recurs with ever-increasing intensity. The gallant South is immediately echoed with growing irony at sweet and fresh, again bending to the voice's lowest depth. Then a string of increasingly bent phrases of burning flesh, for the crows to pluck and for the rain to gather, leads with gathering intensity to the explicit recall of the first stanza at for the wind to suck. The wavering undulations of the southern breeze in line 1 have become the agonizing bends of the sucking wind in line 2. Finally, the closing rhyme words of the song, drop and crop, convey with an elaborately shaped sound sculpture the most prolonged and intricately bent contours of the entire song. It is no longer news that the Afro-American vocal tradition, a tradition Holiday helped create, employs note bending as a principal expressive means. What may be news, however, is the variety of bent note gestures Holiday has at her command and the structural consistency and transformational scope of their employment. The descending arches bending to the vocal depths on Southern, gallant South, and sweet and fresh stand in clear contrast not only to their level, unbent neighbors, but also to the hovering breeze and wind-blown melodic shapes, their sounds reflecting the textual meaning that are the dominating feature of all of the song's apical climactic moments. So that's Bob.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to all of the panelists. I think we have time to open the floor to questions, if anybody has questions for the panelists. I can start with a question if no one has one. I wanted to ask you, Matthias, when you were talking about the hand-drawn spectrographs and sonic design, were they, for the analysis, were they using like really small slices that were done on a computer and then drawing them as a way of like stitching them together, or were they using some other means of analyzing, like an analog set of bandpass filters and kind of tuning them and measuring the amplitude at different parts of the spectrum? Do you know what the process was?
Yeah, from what I remember is that they used data from Carl Seashore mainly, so acoustic data, and from other sources, and they basically just calculate how many overtones are there in a specific sound of a specific instrument, in an orchestra piece, for example, and then added another spectrum of another instrument playing at the same time. So it was a very cumbersome step-by-step process. And then, of course, they also had to consider masking, that some of these overtones may have been canceled by other overtones from other instruments. It's a complex thing to do that. And also taking into account different intensities, so some overtones of a sound may be louder than others. So that was the basic process as far as I remember. But I'm sure, I mean, somebody must be here in the audience who was actually present or took part in those studies, so maybe somebody knows more than I do.
That's fascinating, laborious process. So they would, if it were one note on a particular instrument, they would have had to refer to probably several charts at different intensities. depending on the
Exactly. Yeah,
dynamic.
yeah.
Has anybody done a comparison of these hand-drawn sketches and, a proper spectrograph done with a computer after the fact and how close they were to each other?
Bob himself did that to some extent. So he always used Debussy's Nuage orchestra piece from the Nocturne as an example for demonstration in his seminars and psychophysical analysis courses. And for that purpose, in the 1990s, when I was at NEC, he produced spectrographs with his software. But before, he did the same thing by hand, so you could actually compare what there is in sonic design with these modern spectrographs, and they look surprisingly similar. I mean, they are always slightly different depending on the performance, because there are no two spectrographs that are exactly the same. But the hand-drawn spectrographs are not much different in that respect.
Wow, that's impressive. Any questions from the audience yet? No? Okay. I have one other question. I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to talk about the journal Sonus. I know that Lei and Matthias have had articles in there. Maybe you have too, yeah? Would anyone like to say anything about that experience, how he invited you to contribute, he and Patsy?
Well, I can just say a few words about that. I recall that was the article that was published in Sonus, my short article called About Chinese. It was the first article in English that of mine that was published, and in fact, it was the first article ever that I've ever written to be published in Chinese and in English. And you can imagine how much that meant to me. But what's really important for me is to see Sonus really kind of reflects Cogan's and of course Patsy and Aska, that their growth as scholars and thinkers and composers. Like what Matthias said earlier, this is a life journey for them, and thinking about music is as important a part as composing. So Sonus was one side of that coin for them. This every time I was teaching assistant for Mr. Cogan for a few years, I guess, and I remember each seminar he would bring in new materials. He was a very, very hard worker. Always open new windows for the students, new things to look at, and this continued throughout his life. And it's almost a little intimidating to think about that, because once you have developed a relationship with such a mentor, I feel like he's still watching me, and no matter what I do, I feel like, okay, it's time to move on to some new projects like what Mr. Cogan would do. You can't just stop there. There's always something else for you to explore. There's a new repertoire, there's a new genre you need to explore, there's a new thinking you need to explore, because thinking and composing, creative work and critical thinking are always part of the same journey that one has to do at the same time. So for me, Sonus is a beautiful manifestation of how that journey has meant for him as a thinker.
Thank you.
We were trying to remember when Sonus started. What do you think? 1980.
Yeah, that's
Thank
what
you,
I-
Alice. Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, and it's a journal that was amazing for the variety of approaches and types of music that were discussed in it, and even non-musical things. There were contributions occasionally from historians and scientists and poets, and so it was really I think Bob and Patsy might have been thinking of the little magazines of New York City in the 30s, perhaps, which was before their time, right? But the intellectual magazines that were broad in their approach, that were not specialist or academic, but that were, extremely, sites of curiosity and exploration.
Yeah, I think Sonus was an outlet for Bob and Patsy to publish their research. At the beginning, I always had the impression, even when I was a student here in the 1990s, that there was a certain amount of reservation from the academic community about these spectrographic studies. People didn't quite know what to do with it. Most people were fascinated, but they were also a little maybe scared, or it undermined their expertise to some extent. So it was easier for Bob and Posse to just publish these articles in their own journal. And they also invited a lot of other people to contribute. So I think Sonus was active over 35 years. So it was a long period of publication, 2 issues per year.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I recall one of the first classes of one of his seminars on space and time. And I don't remember that particular year. The very first presentation he gave was a description of images that had just come to Earth from the Hubble Space Telescope. And he described very briefly, as Bob often did, but very briefly, 2 galaxies that have been colliding for millions of years.
Wow.
He just left it that way. That's an intervention for all of us creative. Like, what are you going to do about this?
That's great.
I'll repeat that in a class on sound and space that Cogan was teaching. He brought in images that were taken with the Hubble telescope of 2 galaxies colliding, and sort of showed those images, but I guess as kind of a question or something to respond to, right? What are we going to do about this? That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else like to share any experiences or ask a question?
Just a brief comment about what John just said. I think that's another example for this expansive thinking that Bob had. So he was constantly trying to widen his horizon, but also the horizon of all others who listened to him. And he was very good at that. And I think later in his life, he became very interested in big history, cosmology, and the place that music takes within that very long history of mankind. So yeah, it became bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I know Anne was talking earlier about what a keen listener Bob was as regards listening to music, but I also think, as a teacher and as a person, he's one of the most careful listeners I've ever met. I just remember these incredibly long pauses before he would respond to something in lessons. It could be like 10 to 15 seconds sometimes, and he was just ever so carefully, formulating a response. And he would often refer to something extra, another field besides music. It might be literature or, modern painting, or it could be a composer you wouldn't expect him to necessarily talk about, like Verdi or something like that, versus a contemporary composer. And then he'd follow up by asking some kind of question, which would open a door. He wasn't the type to really kind of push you through that door, but he would constantly be opening new doors and possibilities for his students, which I think is really a great way to teach.
John, you mentioned he would ask questions, and one thing that really sticks with me it was a single seminar. Bob said this once to my knowledge. Maybe he said it in other generations, but he asked a question. We were looking at a piece. He asked an analytical question, and we worked for an hour and a half, and we had an incredible discussion. It was just a great discussion about this piece. And at the end, a student says, "Well, we've answered the question." And then Bob said, I'm sure there was a long pause. And then he said, "You don't ever answer a question. You just move the question to a higher level."
That's great. Okay. If there aren't any other comments or questions, then I guess we'll end our discussion. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you at the concert. And thank you especially to Matthias and Tom Novak for making this possible and organizing the event, and to all the panelists.